It was a warm afternoon when Mr. Caldwell, a man in his late 50s with graying hair and a stern face, sat at his desk, going through applications for the apartment he had just listed. The building had been in his family for generations, and he took pride in keeping it in top condition, with tenants who respected the property and, by extension, him. He was sifting through the papers when one application caught his eye. It was from the Johnson family, a young black couple with a 5-year-old daughter. He felt a familiar unease creep up his spine. He had always believed, without ever admitting it aloud, that people like them brought trouble. He had his reasons, or so he convinced himself. Mr. Caldwell frowned, the prejudice he had harbored for years bubbling to the surface. "Not in my building," he muttered, setting the application aside. He continued to sift through the other applicants, but something about the Johnsons' application kept drawing him back. After some time, he decided to call the couple, intent on finding a way to reject them politely. "Hello, is this Mr. Johnson?" he said, his voice dripping with a forced politeness. "Yes, this is he," came the warm response from the other end. "This is Mr. Caldwell, the landlord for the apartment you applied for. I'm calling to discuss your application," he began, already crafting an excuse in his mind. "I'm afraid there are some concerns regarding your financial stability. I'm not sure if you'll be able to meet the monthly payments." There was a brief pause on the other end before Mr. Johnson spoke again, his voice calm and steady. "I understand, Mr. Caldwell. Would it help if I provided additional documentation to reassure you? My wife and I both have stable jobs, and we've saved diligently for this." Mr. Caldwell hesitated. He hadn't expected Mr. Johnson to be so accommodating. He had expected anger or frustration, something to validate his own biases. That might help," he stammered. "But you see, it's not just about the rent. It's about the community here. We have a certain standard, and I'm not sure if you would fit in." Another pause. Longer this time. When Mr. Johnson spoke again, there was a quiet strength in his voice. "Mr. Caldwell, my family is just looking for a safe and comfortable place to call home. We respect our neighbors and our community, no matter who they are." Mr. Caldwell felt a pang of guilt, but he quickly squashed it. "I'll review the documents, but I can't make any promises." The call ended, and Mr. Caldwell sat back in his chair, feeling uneasy. He had done this before, found reasons to turn away applicants who didn't fit his narrow view of the ideal tenant, but something about this conversation lingered in his mind. A few days later, Mr. Caldwell received a package. Inside were the additional documents Mr. Johnson had promised, along with a handwritten note. The note read, "Dear Mr. Caldwell, thank you for considering our application. We understand the importance of maintaining a good community and would love to contribute positively to it. Enclosed are additional documents that we hope will alleviate any concerns you might have. Sincerely, Charles and Grace Johnson." Mr. Caldwell sighed, feeling the weight of his decision pressing down on him. He wanted to reject the application outright, but something held him back. He decided to do something he hadn't done before: research. He looked up Charles and Grace Johnson online, finding their social media profiles, and even discovered a few articles mentioning them. What he found surprised him. Charles Johnson was a well-respected doctor who had volunteered countless hours at free clinics. Grace was a teacher, known for her dedication to underprivileged children. Their daughter, Lila, was even recognized for starting a charity drive at her kindergarten. These were not the troublemakers he had imagined. They were, in fact, exemplary people, perhaps even more so than most of his current tenants. Mr. Caldwell felt a knot form in his stomach, the realization of his own prejudice hitting him hard. How had he been so blind? How many good people had he turned away over the years, simply because of the color of their skin? The thought sickened him. The next morning, Mr. Caldwell called the Johnsons. When Mr. Johnson answered, there was a trace of hope in his voice. "Mr. Johnson, this is Mr. Caldwell," he began, struggling to find the right words. I want to apologize. I misjudged you and your family. If you're still interested, the apartment is yours." There was a brief silence before Mr. Johnson responded, his voice filled with emotion. "Thank you, Mr. Caldwell. We appreciate the opportunity and look forward to being a part of the community." As Mr. Caldwell hung up the phone, he felt a strange sense of relief, mixed with shame. He had learned a powerful lesson about the assumptions he had allowed to rule his life. In the weeks that followed, The Johnson family moved in, quickly becoming beloved members of the building. Mr. Caldwell found himself interacting with them more often than he had ever done with any of his tenants. They were kind, respectful, and their presence brought a warmth to the building that had been missing for a long time. One day, as Mr. Caldwell watched little Lila play in the courtyard, laughing as she ran after a butterfly, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. He had almost let his prejudice rob him of knowing this wonderful family. From that day forward, he vowed to see people for who they were, not what he assumed them to be. And in doing so, he found a richness in life he had never known before. For Mr. Caldwell, the Johnson family was not just new tenants. They were a reminder of the power of humility, the importance of community, and the need to challenge the biases that limit our ability to truly connect with one another. As time passed, Mr. Caldwell's initial guilt began to fade, replaced by a growing sense of discomfort. The Johnson family had integrated into the community seamlessly, but Mr. Caldwell couldn't shake the feeling that he was losing control over his building, his legacy. One evening, as he walked past their apartment, he overheard Lila's laughter mixed with the gentle hum of conversation from within. It irritated him more than he wanted to admit. This wasn't how things were supposed to be. The building had always been quiet, almost sterile, just the way he liked it. His resentment grew, festering into something darker. He started finding fault in everything the Johnsons did. If their trash bags were left out for even a minute too long, he'd be there, sternly reminding them of the rules. If their daughter played too loudly in the courtyard, he'd insist on quiet, claiming it disturbed the other tenants, though no one had complained. One evening, unable to bear the sense of loss of control any longer, Mr. Caldwell concocted a plan. He began to document every minor infraction, real or imagined, keeping a meticulous record. When he felt he had enough, he made his move. He approached the Johnsons under the guise of a concerned landlord, bringing with him a stack of papers filled with complaints. "I'm sorry, but this can't continue," he said, masking his malice with feigned regret. "There have been too many issues. I'm afraid you'll have to leave." Charles Johnson looked stunned, his calm demeanor cracking under the weight of the accusation. "But we've done nothing wrong, Mr. Caldwell. We've followed every rule." Grace's eyes filled with tears, and little Lila looked up at her parents, confused and frightened. Mr. Caldwell hardened his heart, refusing to acknowledge the pain he was causing. "I'm afraid my decision is final," he said coldly. The Johnsons were given a notice to vacate within a month. Despite their best efforts to fight back, the legal system was on Mr. Caldwell's side. He had the power, and he wielded it ruthlessly. The day the Johnsons left was gray and overcast, mirroring the heavy mood in the building. As they loaded the last of their belongings into their car, Mr. Caldwell watched from a distance, a grim satisfaction settling over him. But the satisfaction was fleeting. As the days turned into weeks, the building returned to its previous quiet state. But it felt emptier, colder. The neighbors, who had grown fond of the Johnsons, kept their distance from Mr. Caldwell, sensing the injustice he had wrought. Mr. Caldwell, once proud of his building, now felt a hollow ache in the pit of his stomach every time he walked through the hallways. The laughter, the warmth, the sense of community, all gone, replaced by a silence that gnawed at him. In the end, Mr. Caldwell was left alone with his building, haunted by the choices he had made. The legacy he had fought so hard to preserve had become a monument to his own bitterness and prejudice. And as the years passed, he grew old and frail, surrounded by walls that echoed with the memories of what could have been. In his final days, as he lay in a cold, empty apartment, Mr. Caldwell realized that he had driven away the very thing that could have brought meaning to his life. But it was too late. The building, once filled with life, now stood as a testament to his own downfall, a legacy of loneliness he could never escape.